good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. You know what's applicable to you, but we don't necessarily know. We have today a international Jack Kirby panel because one of our guests is in a time zone where it's morning. One of them is in a time zone where it's afternoon, and one evening. This shows you the global reach of Jack Kirby. My name is Mark Evanier. In July of 1969, I first met Jack Kirby, and I thought I was just meeting my favorite comic book artist. I discovered I was meeting a man who would be one of my favorite human beings and who would have a major effect on my life. And not a day goes by, not even a couple of hours, where I don't think about Jack or answer questions about Jack or talk about Jack. When I go to a comic convention, it's 10 times as intense, because if you walk around a comic convention, back when we used to actually walk around comic conventions, because there were comic book conventions, you saw Jack Kirby everywhere. If you weren't seeing his artwork, you were seeing characters he designed, you were seeing his influence on other people. So we started doing these panels, these Jack Kirby tribute panels after he passed, because we were talking about Jack anyway, and it was nice to get all the Jack Kirby fans at the convention in the same room at the same time, and you found that they were more imaginative people, smarter people, maybe a little ways. If they appreciated Jack, they appreciated one of the most amazing men who ever worked in the comic book field. We have two amazing men, smart men with us today. Let me bring them in. I would like to introduce you to them. Here is Mr. Jonathan Ross, the eminent TV presenter, as they call them in his native land. Here is Neil Gaiman, the eminent author and fantasy novelist and purveyor of an entire empire of TV shows and movies and things like that. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in your respective time zones.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay. My go-to question in all these panels, and I asked you each of this when you were on Kirby panels in person with me at San Diego, but I don't remember your answers, was what was the Jack Kirby work that first made an impression on you, where you were interested in who had done this, and what was your all-time favorite, which can be the same thing, in many cases is? Who would like to go first?
Neil?
Sure. I know the first Jack Kirby art I would ever have encountered would have been in the black and white Power Comics reprints in probably in a comic called Fantastic or Terrific. I don't remember what was in what. There was a whole line of them: Wham, Smash, Power, Fantastic, and Terrific. And they were black and white reprints of old Marvel comics. That was definitely where I first encountered the mighty Thor. Then I was given a box of American comics when I was about 7. And there was a whole load of Kirby Fantastic Four in color. And I liked it, but I didn't love it. I remember as a kid, the Kirby stuff felt odd. It felt ever so slightly weird. There was I felt much more comfortable in sort of DC Comics. I felt more comfortable looking at someone like Steve Ditko. And then he came over to DC Comics, and I would have been about 11. And I remember picking up Jimmy Olsen and going, this is weird, and this is very, very different. And this is that guy over at Marvel. And I'm liking this. And then I picked up a copy of the Forever People because it had Dead Man in, and I was a Dead Man fan. And I was in love. And I remember it was that moment that you tip from I like this, I like this, I like this, to I am in love. I was in love with just in love with everything Kirby did. And at that point, I became somebody whose pocket money went on anything Kirby did for the next 5 or 6 years.
So it was Jack's least favorite issue of Forever People that hooked you. Yeah. Is that, because he did that under duress. DC forced him to put Deadman. He didn't want to use Deadman at all because he thought, what's a dead hero? What's the value of a dead hero in this thing? And he actually had Steve Sherman and myself, we were assisting Jack doing very little, write up an outline, which he used about 4 words out of for that issue. And he was very disappointed at that issue, but it still came through. Something still came through for you there.
It was the seance. There was a scene in there where Jack draws this amazing sort of seance where they've all linked hands with this mad old lady and the forever people, and they're talking, you know, and they suddenly find themselves making contact with Deadman, and then they build him an android body and stuff. I had zero interest in the android body, but I just loved, I don't know, it's so funny because one of the things that I loved best about Jack was Jack getting creepy, which he did so rarely. So much of what Jack did was all about, you know, it occurs in daylight. And then you get his spirit world stuff. You got that issue of the Forever People, and above all, you get the demon. I recently bought my first ever Jack Kirby page, and I've not bought Jack Kirby pages for years and years, and even back when I remember being in Comics Showcase in 1986 or 87, and they had all these Thor pages out, and going, well, I'd really like one, but they're £50. Oh, that's a lot of money, and not buying them. And Lord alone knows what I just spent on a demon page, and it's got Clarion the Witch Boy and Jason Blood, and it's from, you know, I think probably one of my very favorite issues. And one of the things I loved about the demon was just Jack let whatever the creepy thing was that he did so incredibly well come out. And it's the same thing that happened in Jimmy Olsen, where he'd bring on sort of tributes to robot versions of old monsters. You know, everybody talks about Jack as the power with which he would create superheroes, superhero costumes, people hitting each other, amazing machines, the Kirby crackle, the super science, you know, you can look at something like the Mother Box and think about how every phone that we have now has become this sort of failed Mother Box. But I think for me, the thing that actually chimed and resonated, which may actually have some kind of equivalence with the kind of comics that I went on to famously create, the slightly more creepy stuff, was Jack letting his inner creepy out.
Okay, Jonathan.
I mean, not dissimilar story in some ways, because Neil and I, of course, grew up in the same country, and we're virtually the same age. Neil, as you can tell, I'm sure is a week older than me, so you know. That's apparent, I think. But I didn't have the POW, the Terrific. I didn't really have them so much. But I got hold of some comics from. We used to buy secondhand comics from. I guess it would be a thrift store in America. I guess where people take stuff in to sell it, but we called them junk shops. And they were slightly different. They rarely had clothing, but they would have books, and they would have objects like vases or wacko players and old vinyl, and they would have a pile of comics normally defaced with a big black marker with the price on the front cover, 3p they would be. And then once you'd read them, you could take them back in and swap them and get half the money back towards the next one if you wanted. And so I had a random bunch of Marvel comics. It was always Marvel for me. I never really got into DC as a kid. And so I loved Marvel generally. I loved the kind of feeling of it being part of a club. But in particular, I honed in on Kirby's work, and in particular, the Fantastic Four. And I remember the random issues I had a copy of number 3 with no cover, which I held on to. I've still got that very copy. I assumed that would one day be my pension fund. And you can imagine it's freed up as hell, rips all over it and coupons cut up. It looks amazing. But But I also had issues in the 40s and 50s when the Inhumans appear, when there's a crossover with Daredevil, the Watcher figures quite prominently, Galactus. And I remember in particular as well, the issue of FF, which has the thing on the cover, This Man, This Monster, where he's standing. And I think what I reacted to and what I responded to, rather, which really resonated with me, was the pathos that Kirby managed to always put into these kind of man monsters in his comic. You know, you had an element of it in the Hulk, but that was always a bit less subtle for me. But the Thing in particular, I loved the Thing. I loved the way he wrote him. I loved the family unit of the Fantastic Four, which of course appears in Challengers and other Kirby group books. But I loved that, and so I really responded to that. But later on, the work that I responded to most would be, like Neil, would have been his DC period. When New Gods appear, I felt like this was the most amazing cultural shift I'd ever experienced, and I think possibly it still is. You know, it was this moment where, hold on, this is what comics can be. You know, and a lot of people talk about, you know, the explosion into other people discovered underground comics, or there's an explosion into kind of graphic novels and more adult themes. But I felt Kirby managed to do those adult themes and certainly create this kind of incredible mythos, this incredibly rich mythology with those Fourth World books, which they're still my favorite comic books by him, and possibly my favorite comic books by anyone. I mean, the Fourth World books in particular, you know, New Gods, Mr. Miracle, which is less central to it. Forever People I loved, although I did kind of respond to his Kirby's, I thought, kind of being an old guy now, trying to write teen dialogue was slightly cringy, in the way that Hanna-Barbera cartoons always drew young people as wearing a red cravat for some reason, and I'd never seen anyone wearing that in real life.
You never saw Joe Barbera. That's the problem.
But then, as Neil said, you know, I really responded to Kirby's creep as well. And the demon. I mean, because as soon as you started talking about that, Neil, I started thinking about Agatha Harkness and the Fantastic Four. And I remember loving that development, and then suddenly it becoming a supernatural comic momentarily. So he did creepy so well. You're right. And the demon is one of my favorites. So I can't really choose one, but it would be from that 70s period when Kirby basically revitalized DC completely with all of those books, including Commandy as well, which I adored.
Okay. You know, there was after Jack passed away, I got an email, a paper letter. That's how long ago that was now. From I heard from a lot of people who had grief or problems in coping with the fact that Jack was gone. And somehow they figured, well, I have to put this somewhere. I'll send it to Mark Evanier. And I got a letter from a spot welder. And this guy had an explanation. I wish I had the letter still. I don't know where it is. Explaining how Jack Kirby comics inspired him to become a better spot welder. And it actually made sense in his context, because he always felt in Jack's work there was this maximum effort, that everything was 110%, that the story was told fully and there was an energy there, and it inspired him to approach his work with, I've got to give 110% all the time. Did either of you ever feel that reading Jack Kirby comics, you know, obviously it can inspire you to think of stories about weird creatures or monsters or demons or commandees or whatever. Did either of you ever feel that Jack inspired you just as a person to approach your work, whatever you were doing at the moment, better? Or am I asking a question that has no answer whatsoever?
I don't know who I would be if I hadn't encountered Jack's work. It's like there would be parts of my life missing. What I loved about Jack's work, which I think is what I was actually kind of reacting against when I encountered it first as a kid, was the individualism, was the fact that nobody else had done this and nobody else could do this. Nobody else could have drawn these people, have invented these people, have given them this dialogue, and have built up something with so much energy and power. And you sort of encountering that was inspiring. And it was inspiring because you'd look at that and you go, well, I can't do this. I'm absolutely not. I can't be Jack, but maybe I can be me. And that, lean into the idea that you could lean into the things that you couldn't help but do. Lean into the stuff that you enjoy, and obviously have the time of your life. I mean, that was the other thing with Jack, is he was obviously having fun. You could see that he was enjoying drawing, and that was there. In the same way that you can sometimes look at pages drawn by people and you can go, oh, they broke your spirit so long ago. And with Jack, you could tell there was enjoyment, and you could also tell that he could take a weird assignment and turn it upside down and find out what was interesting in it. Do you remember the Superman episode of Commandy?
Yeah.
The goofiest thing. Let's do a Superman Commandy crossover, and Commandy is in his own universe, and yet it turns into a weird thing about the inspirational power of putting on a costume and possibly firing gorillas wearing costumes through the air. It so gloriously mad, so inventive, and so taking the dead man lemon and making a sort of glorious lemonade out of it.
It's interesting, Neil, I think, because if you look at the massive and undisputable creative energy, force, genius that Kirby possessed, of course, your career in comics would be marked by your biggest crowning achievement, and you had many, of course, and now, of course, you have a whole different fan base, I would have thought, as a novelist as well as a TV person with good omens. But you look at Sandman, of course, which was your an incredible achievement by you, an amazing piece of work, and quite rightly lauded and loved by millions. But of course, that began as a starting point with you reworking, spinning off from one of Kirby's lesser, weirder creations, which I imagine probably no one else wanted to touch.
Yeah.
But the people who wanted to touch it probably wanted to replicate the original Sandman in some way, for the most part, and not bring anything new to the party.
That was the significance. As Neil said, the thing about Kirby that maybe inspired him and maybe inspires all of us is that Kirby was uniquely Kirby. And if you can take that from his work and say, okay, I will try and be uniquely me, which is what Neil did with Sandman, of course. So in a way, it's very much in the spirit of the King that you took, as I said, one of his weirder, lesser creations, but then made it something which is uniquely your own.
Well, I always loved the idea that Jack, when going to DC, said, what is your lowest selling, least popular title? And when they said Jimmy Olsen, he said, I will take that.
Well, that's not actually true. Yeah. I mean, so he could have done that. It is
apocryphal, but beautiful. What really happened, Mark?
What really happened there was, and this is, I'm going to try not to, I'll take the rest of this podcast if I tell the whole story, but DC signed Jack up with really no idea what he was going to do for sure. But originally he was kind of baited and switched in a way. What DC originally offered him and what the final contract was were quite different. He thought he was getting into something where he wouldn't be chained to the board to do X number of pages a week. And eventually it turned into 15 pages a week because he felt he couldn't stay at Marvel at that point. That was his only other place to go. He was kind of forced into it. So they made a deal for him to do 15 pages of comics a week, and he was paid commensurate with that. Then the question becomes, well, what do we want to have him do for the 15 pages a week? And he had this idea for, the New Gods and the Forever People, Mr. Miracle, and quite a few other books. If DC had said no to New Gods, Forever People, Mr. Miracle, there would have been 3 other new comics there. There would have been 8 other new comics there. Jack was an endless fount of new comics, which is one of the reasons, which worked against him, was one of the reasons they felt they could, quote, suspend, in other words, cancel New Gods and Forever People because he'd come up with another book the next day.
Yeah.
And at that point in comics, remember, this is before royalties of any sort and before they even would put creator credits on stuff. A lot of people at DC who were creative wouldn't even do that. They just wouldn't even give a new idea to the company. So they started saying, well, let's put New Gods into Showcase and we'll put it out, 3 issues bi-monthly and see how it sells. Okay, but then what's he going to do otherwise? How's he going to fill up the 15 pages a week? So they started 3 comics, and that didn't take it up. 3 bi-monthlies, because DC would refuse to make them monthly, would not take up 15 pages a week. So they said, you've got to take another comic on. We can't start that many new comics for you. They didn't think this out before they signed him. It's stunning to me how much happened to Jack because people in publishing positions didn't think ahead. So they said, pick any comic we're doing and you'll take it over. And he looked at all the DC books and didn't like any of them. He just didn't like them. He didn't see anything in there that interested him. He did not want to take back Challengers of the Unknown because that would have been moving backwards. So he said, look, I don't have a feel for any of these things. Just pick whatever book doesn't have a writer or artist on it. Now, along the way, Jack probably said, give me your worst-selling book, I'll make it your best-selling book. I'm sure he said that because that's how Jack talked. He was so gung-ho about everything he did, not in a conceited way. He just had a very strong confidence that he could work harder than anyone else and succeed. And not necessarily where anyone else failed, but he could succeed. Jack's confidence was not, I'm better than other people. His confidence was, I'm good, with no disrespect to other people.
What's interesting? Yeah.
So Jimmy Olsen was a book that at that moment did not have a writer or artist assigned to it. And Jack had been talking about doing they'd wanted him to do Superman. And simultaneously, there was the fact they said, well, Jack's ideas about Superman didn't make sense when he pitched them verbally. So they thought, maybe we need to get him to do a story before we'll understand what he's saying. Simultaneously to that, nobody was assigned to do Jimmy Olsen because Pete Costanza, who'd been the artist, had stopped drawing because of illness, and whoever was writing it was not writing it anymore. And some had Joe Kubert, who was an editor at DC, was saying, get Jack to do the Newsboy Legion. Newsboy Legion, greatest comic book ever done in history. Bring back the Newsboy Legion. And Jimmy Olsen seemed like a place where, he was a reporter, so you could kind of figure out the Newsboy Legion might fit in there. So Jack got Jimmy Olsen.
Amazing.
A completely strange, bizarre choice. But you're right, he did approach it with, I can take the worst-selling book and make it into something. When I met Jack, one of the first questions I asked him, which everybody asked him, was, what do you like doing best? Do you like doing the Westerns? Do you like doing the crime comics? Do you like doing the superheroes? And he was happy with anything. If somebody had told him, do Mutant Penguins, he would have done Mutant Penguins. If somebody had told him, do Turtles, he would have done the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles years before Eastman and Laird did, or something like that. So everything was a challenge. And I think one of the keys to his relationship with Stan Lee came that if Stan gave him a name or Stan gave him a 2-line concept, Jack would take it as a personal challenge to build it into something the same way he did with, I got to put Dead Man in the story. Okay, here's what I'll come up with for Dead Man. So anyway, yeah, and I interrupted you.
On the one hand, I remember hearing some of that before and reading about Kirby wanting to be more of a writer and an editor and overseeing these books and getting these ideas out there without being a slave to the board. But obviously, I look back and God, wouldn't have been great if he'd have had that freedom. But at the same time, the artwork is so spectacular in that period that selfishly, I'm glad that Kirby didn't get the deal he wanted, because we wouldn't have had those amazing pages. We wouldn't have had all of that great stuff, including Days of the Modern Spirit World, as you said, and the Black Romance book, which didn't come out but was recently being published by Tomorrow's, and you've got those great pages floating around. Just exquisite art, really, him in his prime. But to answer the question, what I get from it in a way is, as I grow older and I look with a greater sense of appreciation of what he achieved, and I look at the work, and the work impresses me more now than it did before. Bear in mind, he was probably always my favorite comic book artist of all time, but looking at it now, I'm still struck by just the the brilliance of his draftsmanship and the speed with which he can capture a situation and the energy he puts into the page. So for me, I'm getting from him thinking, okay, he was still doing this incredible work in his 60s and up into his 70s. And so I like to think I speak for all of the panel here when I say that we can take some solace from that. And despite the fact that we're all now we've all been vaccinated. Have you been vaccinated, Neil?
No, but I'm in New Zealand where we're.
I need to be vaccinated, yeah, because no one wants to go there.
I have my vaccination card right here. I got
I've
my
got
second shot the other day.
So we're doddering old folk, but we can still create. Let's take that from Kirby, because he was still producing world-beating, original, unforgettable concepts into his old age.
One of the things I always remember with Jack, I'm going to show here a picture. I got a couple of pictures here. This is me at a comic convention sitting next to Jack. This is about 1972. I think it was the Disneyland. There was a convention in the Disneyland Hotel. I think that's what this was. And I was planted there by Roz because she had to go do something. And it was my job to play bad cop and tell everybody, no, Mr. Kirby will not do a drawing for you of all the Avengers. Which people would come up and ask for all the time, or they all wanted sketches from him. And Jack didn't want to do them, but he didn't know how to say no to people. So Roz would say no on his behalf, interrupt him and say, no, Kirby, you promised me you wouldn't do that. And so I had to do that and play bad cop, and people hated me. But that picture always reminds me that I am now like 10 years older than Jack was when I met him in 1969. Maybe more than that even. Yeah, I am more than that. And he was starting all those books, New Gods for People, Mr. Miracle, at a time in the business when a lot of other people would have already done whatever innovative work they had to bring to the field. He was still at it, and he was working hard. I've told this story on other panels, but there was one day when I looked at Jack. This is 71 or 72. And I said to myself, Mark, you're never going to have the brilliance of this man, because nobody's going to have the brilliance of this man. But it might be possible to work that hard. And, as we look on the internet, we look at reviews and things, people have lots of criticism of Jack's work. They don't like the way he drew knees. They don't like the way he drew fingertips. They don't like some of his dialogue, whatever it is. And I don't have a problem with that. I kind of flinch when somebody says he looked like he was just knocking out. He wasn't trying hard. And I don't think that was ever the case with anything Jack did. He gave 110% on every single project he ever did. And if it isn't up to his great standards, it's because his eyes were failing him, or he was very unhappy at the company. But the man's work ethic was astonishing. And I say this as a witness who would see Jack sitting there at the board night and day when I visited there. He'd go to the drawing table around 11 o'clock in the morning each day, and pretty much stay there till 4 in the morning. And Roz would come in and I was not a witness to this, but she'd come in at 4 in the morning and say, Kirby, come to bed. And he'd say, 2 more panels. I got to save the universe, or something like that. And he would go to bed at 5 in the morning. And during that span, he took time out to eat with his family. He took time out for dinner. He might watch a favorite TV show. But he put in a 12-hour day easily on all those comics he did, at least, maybe more than that.
Something.
And excuse me, one more thing. And he would finish a page that you and I would pay good money for and go, nah, this isn't right, and just to start erasing.
Oh, no.
He would do a beautiful page a couple times in my time for him. And I always emphasize that I contributed very, very little to the published comics. He'd hand me a page and say, here, take those panels out. He had me the eraser, and I had to erase 2 panels of Jack Kirby art because he thought of a better way to stage the scene. And it was never, I can draw that better. It was always, the drawing is wrong. Not, I can draw, the foot better or the arms better, whatever. The drawing was never changed because it was a bad drawing. It was changed because it wasn't the right drawing. So,
one of the things that inspires me about him and fascinates me about him, and there was only a few other talented folk I'm aware of like this. I mean, Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire had this. I think David Bowie had this. Was that even when they got older in their career, even when they created work which would have assured them their place in posterity, they were still creating, but they were still very much engaging with all of the new trends that were emerging, all of the new ideas that were coming up. I mean, Bowie wanted to work in drum and bass. He wanted to work with all the new producers. Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire would have conversations in the 70s about, have you managed to do a dance routine with a skateboard yet? I almost broke my wrist the other day. Anything new that came up, they were engaged with. And I get the feeling Kirby was also that way. He wasn't someone who was looking back thinking, oh, I wish the 40s were happening again. The 50s were great. I love the 60s. He was always looking forward to the next thing, but also was being inspired by. He seemed to have a voracious appetite for new culture, new science, new ideas.
Yeah, the Forever People was about that kind of. There were in 1970, there were a lot of people who'd been in comics who felt threatened by all these new kids coming in, the Len Weins, Marv Wolfmans, Jerry Conways, me,
Neil Gaiman,
all those other people. Yeah, that's right. No, Neil wasn't around in 1970. He was home, reading Forever People #8. But
I was.
There were some people who were resistant to that because the business did not pay well, but it seemed to be very stable. Once you were entrenched at DC or Marvel in 60s, they felt obligated to keep giving you work. It's one of the reasons, people sometimes ask me, why was this lousy artist on this comic in 1973? Well, he'd been working for the company for 22 years and nobody had the heart to tell him, find some other way to feed your family. They felt an obligation to keep using these people, which explains some of the strange, and even if they didn't have the right book for them, which explains some of the strange casting. But Jack was fascinated by young people. He welcomed them into his studio all the time. We took a couple of field trips, Steve Sherman and the Kirbys and I, to what they called them head shops then. It was the places that sold underground comics, and they also sold the paraphernalia for marijuana use, and they sold incense, and they sold hippie style clothing and such. And Jack was fascinated by that. In fact, he got thrown out of one of them because his cigar was fouling the air. He had a cigar, and this place, there's incense going all the places, and there's all these strange scents around, and they said, put your cigar out or get out of here, Mr. But he was fascinated by underground comics, very thrilled to see that there was a venue then, which was rare, that someone could write and draw a comic book, publish it, get paid for it, and have complete control of the package, own the copyright, and do a book that was very personal. What Robert Crumb was doing at the time seemed more extraordinary than perhaps it does now because we have so many personal visions in comic books.
Mark, may I interject?
Yes.
You say that, but I'm curious. So what did he make of when Wally Wood tried to set up a company in which he had some control with Tower, and when Ditko went to work for Wood with Wits End and tried to bring out Mr. A, when there were these efforts by people, even in the late 60s, if I'm correct, to have some ownership and have some sense of control and benefit from the profits that their creations would provide, what was Kirby's awareness of that, or his reluctance to join in with that?
Well, he was all for it. He was all for that. Jack was reared in an era and had a ethic built into him that the most important thing a human being does in this world is provide for their family. That was number one, and he made occasional compromises in what he wanted to do because of that. There's kind of a sub-theme in New Gods about the two faces of Orion, what he does idealistically and what he does pragmatically. He has a different face for the pragmatic part where he has to, be a warrior and fight and do things he might consider horrendous. But he encouraged fanzines. He encouraged self-publishing. Wally Wood did not apparently have all that much power on Thunder Agents. He just had the power to write and draw some comics, which they used. But Jack felt that venue of comic books in the 60s, to which Tower went through, was a rigged game because the publishers controlled it so tightly. And indeed, there's some stories about Tower Comics and Thunder Agents being squeezed off the stands because Archie Comics wanted more rack room and things like that. I don't know how true they are. He gave great encouragement when Gil Kane started his company called Adventure House Press, which one issue of his name is Savage, and the whole company collapsed. And that scared Jack a lot, that there was no way to do anything in that field. The first issue of Wit's End, the Wally Wood published, has a drawing that Jack did in it because Jack had promised to do something for it, and he never was able to find the time to turn down paying work to do something essentially for free for Wood. He also had a few problems with Mr. Wood's, I'll say nice way, stability. But he was all for that. He was all for people, and he was very encouraging of people who came to him who said, "Oh, I want to do comics," saying, "Do something else." He encouraged them to explore other things. There's quite a few stories where people went to Jack and said, here's my writing, here's my drawing. I hope someday to do, I can write the Fantastic Four, draw Hulk." And he said, no, you can be much more than that. Don't aspire to do my work, do your work, and such. So he was, Jack welcomed the new generation wholly and fully into comics, and he treated everybody like a full professional, even if they weren't yet.
Yeah. Mark, sorry, Neil, I don't want to dominate, but if you've got questions, I've got two questions just occurred to me. One is, we talked about Wally Wood, and Wally Wood was, as an inker on Kirby's pages, they're some of my favorite pages. I mean, he's the Sky Master stuff, and I think he did some stuff at Marvel over Kirby as well,
He inked a couple of covers on an issue of Thor, an issue of Tales of Suspense.
Beautiful work.
An issue of X-Men.
So I'm going to ask you about who Kirby preferred inking him. I know it's a game we all play occasionally. But also, I'm curious, you said he went to these head shops. What did Jack make of the more overtly sexual and the more kind of overtly kind of drug culture stories in the underground comic books? Did he approve of the medium being used that way? Did he enjoy reading that stuff as well? Or did he find it not for him?
He did not expect to understand it all, and he didn't understand it all, and he didn't get the drug references. But what excited him was the freedom. The guy who I think most impressed him probably was Richard Corbin, because what Richard Corbin was doing was kind of in the Kirby arena. But Gilbert Shelton or Spain Rodriguez or any Crumb, certainly, all these guys. He loved the fact that these guys were writing and drawing what they wanted to write and draw. Even if he didn't like it, he respected it, and he loved the copyright lines, and he loved the fact that nobody was telling them to draw like somebody else. And that was one of the great things about the underground. You saw all these different styles emerging, and people were telling personal stories. And if it was erotica, fine. If it was drug related, fine. If that's what they have to say, let them say it. The freedom of the press thing excited him a lot. He never, Harvey Kurtzman had asked Jack at one point to create they proposed that the two of them create a Barbarella type strip for Playboy. When Kurtzman was doing Little Annie Fanny, it was not every month. They did like 4 stories a year they got done, because Mr. Kurtzman, was the kind of guy who would take, 4 months to do a 3-page story. But he went to Jack and said, let's do a strip. And he sent him a copy of Barbarella, which Jack had never seen before, from France. And let's do and Jack just said, I can't do that. He said, get Wally Wood. He can do that.
Yeah.
I can't draw naked women like that. I can't draw something. He knew what the strip should be. He just didn't feel that he was the guy to do it.
But Mark, what about Galaxy Green that you almost got off the ground with him? Wasn't that going to be a sexy sci-fi series?
Galaxy Green was a thing he'd been sitting on for a while, and that
was your idea.
No, that was Jack's idea. Well, it was Jack's idea. I said, the idea was do something. We were putting together a prospectus for a new magazine that was going to be called Super World, and it was going to be a tabloid with comics in it and other things. And the idea was, we said to Jack, why don't you do a comic you would never do for DC or Marvel? And he had been thinking about Galaxy Green, the basic concept of it, for some time, and that's about as erotic as Jack could have made it. I mean, it's not that.
Neil, do you know Galaxy Green?
I have no. I mean, in my head, obviously, this is kind of like Camberwick Green, only set in a galaxy.
It's a bunch of space Amazons who go hunting for men because they're rare in the galaxy at this point, and they have these phallic ray guns And he only did 2 pages of it, and he enjoyed doing it. Mike Royer inked it, and it never went anywhere, although it got ripped off by a couple of other people in other venues soon after. But he, it just, I'll tell you, I think I told this story one other time, but we got when the fan mail came in on New Gods for People, Mr. Miracle, the mail went to a P.O. box that the Kirbys had in Thousand Oaks, and Jack would read every letter and then give them to Steve and me to make a letter page out of. And one time he said, "Guys, we got the greatest fan letter in the history of mankind here. This is the greatest fan letter you've ever seen." How could a fan letter be that great? And what it was 2 ladies named Maxine and Alice, they said their name were, had taken photos of themselves with their faces covered by issues of Forever People and New Gods they were reading, and the rest of them was naked with their legs posed for Hustler magazine. And Jack said, "Now those are fans. Those are real fans." And
the other night sent new pictures of us to Kirby. We never got an answer.
Well, I think that's self-explanatory, don't you? But he did not put up a barrier against the new young people at all. He welcomed them. There's a quote he said, and I think I may have the wording right. He said, "The world's going to belong to the young people soon. I just hope they make room for me to live in it." and he was like that, so encouraging to people, so giving to them. People say he treated you really well, Mark. We treated everybody well. I mean, that was not unusual. I'm getting strange spam calls here. I'm sorry. But something like the Galaxy Green strip, I wish, in hindsight, that Jack had had more opportunity to just do whatever he felt like. I look at his work like that, and I think, gee, I wish more people. I wish one of the things that I thought of doing at one point is one of those ideas you kick yourself. I wish when I was doing stuff for Eclipse, I wish I just let them said to me, "Give me a book, let me do whatever I want," and gone to Jack and say, "Jack, draw your reminiscences of World War II. Draw the stories you remember." He did a little of that in that story Street Code for Richard Kyle, who gave him a bunch of pages and said, "Draw childhood memories." Yeah. I wish he'd had a chance to do more autobiographical stuff. His work was very autobiographical as it was.
There was that story, the Losers story, about the little science fiction fan.
Yeah.
Which I always felt, I mean, that had that pathos that Jonathan was talking about, but I always felt that there was, more than most people, there was Kirby in that character, the guy who's reading the science fiction magazines and imagining this huge and amazing future while being mocked by all of the other soldiers, who then still manages to make something fabulous happen while still feeling somehow fraudulent.
Yeah, that's as I read old Kirby work, it becomes more and more autobiographical to me. I read every so often. I will just sit down and I'll read all of the New Gods books again, or I'll read all the Commandy books, and every time I find some personal reference to the Jacks that didn't dawn on me before, some equivalence to his own life. Yeah, I think he did a lot of that. I think he could have done more of it. And getting back to what Jonathan asked about inkers, I wish that Jack had fewer inkers like Wally Wood who changed the work. I wish he had more Mike Royers in his life. I wish, I don't understand some of these people, and Wally Wood's kind of an exception, but who say, "Oh, I really liked Jack inked by this guy because he changed all the fingertips and changed the anatomy." How do you like Jack Kirby work because it looks less like Jack Kirby? I don't get that.
My favorite one of those, I have to say, is Barry Windsor Smith inking him in that Captain America's Bicentennial Battles, the first, 10 pages, where you don't feel that he's changing it. You just feel that these two people are meeting, and that here's Barry bringing this freight of pre-Raphaelite elegance and beauty, And here's Jack bringing all of the power and energy, and here is an art style that you could not quite have imagined.
And of course, they were being simpatico because when, as we know, when Barry Smith first started working for Marvel, he was doing kind of crude and his own version of Kirby. You know, that Daredevil cover, those X-Men pages, you know, all that stuff was it X-Men Blaster? Really Kirby.
Yes, yeah.
And the way you told me that time, Neil, you told me the story about when P. Craig Russell inked Ditko on ROM, and he really invested so much extra time and energy into that because he wanted the Ditko pages to have the richness and the fluidity and the kind of beauty of early Ditko work, which at that stage Ditko was not really putting into that for-hire work.
Well, Ditko was one of those artists who drew mostly in ink. When he penciled for someone else, the pencils were very sparse because that's the way he penciled for himself. You know, when he drew Spider-Man, there was no webbing in the pencils. He put the webbing on in the inking and added most of the backgrounds in the inking and things of that sort. It's one of the reasons Wally Wood liked inking him, because there was not stuff that had to be changed. Wood liked it to be complete control of the light sources of the panel. He didn't want the penciler putting in shadows because he was going to change them anyway. But Jack, when I first met him, did not care who inked him. In 1969, when I asked him, who's your favorite inker? He said, anybody's fine. Anybody's good. Any professional can do it, because the stuff that mattered to him on the page, any professional inker would capture, which was the whole story. He didn't really care that much about the textures and the costumes and things like that. One of the main things that changed over the years was Jack's attitude. He came to appreciate Mike Royer in a way he had not appreciated his previous inkers, because he looked at the finished pages and saw more Kirby than he was used to seeing. And he also had so many people telling him how much they liked Mike Royer, personal feedback. And keep in mind that Jack, before the New God stuff, Jack was really not the editor who hired the inker. He was in the Simon and Kirby studios. That was a different situation. But at Marvel, he handed the work in and generally did not look at it. He didn't even read the finished pages that after Stan had dialogued them.
You know, and I understand that, but I still always found it weird that, and obviously he's somewhat reviled by Kirby fans, but the Vince Colletta pages in Thor in particular, where when you look at the original, you see not only did Vince not put the work in to capture the energy of Kirby, but he would erase background characters and details, presumably because it was too much work.
I don't want to attribute that. Vince did a ridiculous amount of work. Vince was very prolific. During the time that he was inking Jack at DC, he was inking the 15 pages a week Jack penciled, and he was always also inking about 4 more books. And that's not humanly possible. I mean, the workload. Joe Sinnott said he could never have inked 15 pages of Kirby a week.
I could ink 15 pages of Kirby a week if I did them as badly as Vince Colletta.
Well, I thought Vince Colletta was miscast. I think a lot of our bad art in comics, or art I didn't like, was miscasting.
On the pages where he puts the work in, when you look at some of the covers and you look at some of the black and white work that Kirby did, Vince is complimented it. It's quite nice. It's quite pleasing. But you get the feeling it was just a kind of haste and the lack of attention to detail and the lack of time he would spend on it that really made some of those Thor pages look so slight, so lacking in the kind of depth that Kirby had obviously put on the page at the pencil stage.
Well, given what the business paid, which was not, and given that, people, here's a little pet thing of mine is people who don't like Vince Colletta art act like he broke into the office and stole the pages and took them home. Each month, Stan Lee would take the new issue that Vince inked, and he'd say, "Great job, Vince. Here's the next issue to ink." And nobody would say to him. On occasion, someone would say, "Hey, you rushed this one. Try to do more." Occasionally, they'd hand an issue to John Romita and say, "Here, put no more background lines. Add some more black areas." There's touch-ups on a lot of those pages. There's touch-ups on everybody's pages at Marvel.
There's stories about Vince Colletta, which we probably can't go into here, though, of course, about the roles he played in Marvel and what else he supplied to keep his jobs going. I'm sure they're largely invented, but it's a fabulously kind of rich and colourful footnote.
Well, yeah, I think Jack had a very odd attitude about inkers. At one point, I told him, this is at while we're doing New Gods, I mentioned how much I loved. This is before Royer. I mentioned how much I loved when Bill Everett inked Thor for a while. And Jack went, Bill Everett never inked Thor. And I said, yes, he inked Thor for about, a year, half a year, something like that. And Jack went, no, Bill Everett, why would Bill Everett be inking somebody else? Bill Everett is a great artist. And Jack had a box of old Marvels, and I rummaged through them, and I found an issue of Thor that Bill Everett had inked. And I said, here, Bill Everett. And Jack had never, if he'd read the credits, he hadn't registered in them. He didn't notice that there was a lot more lines on the page than the previous issue, maybe. I think Everett followed George Klein, or no, whatever. Anyway, whatever it was, Jack was going like, why is he inking? Why is Bill Everett inking me? Why isn't he doing his own work? He felt the same way about Wally Wood. Why would Wally Wood ink me when Wally Wood could sit down and write and draw his own comic? There were these guys there. Jack loved almost all the professionals of the business. The only way the only negative he would say about another professional was that the guy was either lazy or derivative. If you wrote and drew something that was unique and hard, had effort behind it, Jack loved it, whether he liked the story or not.
And so how did the Kirbys deal with it when artists appeared on the scene? And I'm thinking specifically of Rich Buckler and Ron Wilson, who clearly swiped very heavily and directly from Kirby.
They were wild about that because over the years, Marvel lawyers would occasionally assert that they owned Jack's art style, and that they even owned Jack's image. He didn't like being drawn into a Marvel comic, as he was occasionally, because Marvel's lawyers had said, we own your likeness. You drew yourself into a story once, therefore we own your likeness. And how would you feel if somebody said we got the right to impersonate you? So he was bothered by that. He was bothered, on the one hand, his attitude was, hey, guys have to make a living. If this is what they need to do to make a living, okay. On the other hand, I remember he saw a cover once that was somebody swiping. The whole cover was a swipe. It was like a Kirby panel been blown up. And, Jack said, why don't they just reprint my cover and pay me some money for it instead of paying that guy for it? So he thought it was a bit of a racket. I don't think he understood why people would do that.
How did he feel about Lichtenstein?
Jack claimed that Lichtenstein came to the Simon and Kirby studios looking for work, and he turned him down. And he said, this guy had the last laugh on us. He suddenly was getting, hundreds of thousands of dollars for blowing up our work and signing his name to it. In a way that people will think, a lot of people think it's mercenary to judge your income and say, well, I should have gotten paid for this. But to Jack, it was that was money that could have gone to put my kids through college. That was money that could have gone for my kids' medical expenses. So if somebody cheated him out of money, they were cheating his kids out of braces or whatever it was. And he, as a father, Jack's last years, when he felt very mortal because of health problems, were all about, I've got to leave a nest egg for Roz. I've got to leave money for Roz. I don't think a lot of people have grasped how devoted Jack was to his family, and especially to Roz, his wife, who was everyone in the world should have a wife who loves them and takes care of them the way Roz Kirby took care of Jack. And everybody, people were coming up after Jack passed and Roz came to conventions without her. People were coming up to her who understood and saying, thank you for all that wonderful Jack Kirby work, because she was responsible for all that wonderful Jack Kirby work. She's the one who got him to the board every morning and got him to go to bed and took care of him and drove him because Jack didn't drive. And was his reason, the family was his reason for working as hard as he did. So to cheat them out of, or to do something where Jack could have been paid for it, bothered them the way it would bother any of us if we were really obsessed with, I've got to make this much money this week to do right by my family experiences. That was a very... It's
very straightforward. His reaction to all this stuff seems to be it's not artistic. It's not like, okay, these are my concepts, my idea, this is stuff that represents me. This was like, it's work. This is my work. And you're taking my work for me. Whereas now, the creator battle often seems to be more like, and understandably so, but coming from a very different perspective of like, hold on, I've created this is uniquely mine. How can you take what is mine from me? Whereas Kirby seems to be much more, it's almost much more of a transactional exchange, which I guess is common for men and women, I guess, from that era, from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah. Jack never stopped being the kid who grew up in poverty. Most of those guys didn't. There's a whole other argument or discussion we could have sometime about the way the Depression affected the way everybody in comics in the 60s was and what they put up with that we would not put up with today. Neil would not take on assignments the way a Gardner Fox or John Broome did today as this is my job. I got to do this. I don't want to do this comic, but I will because it's my job. Because today, the way the business has changed, and the fact that Neil is not a comic book writer and nothing else, has changed the game plan. Today, pencilers can get rid of the inkers they don't like. Today, they can turn down assignments. Today, once a person's established themselves, they can kind of dictate to some extent what they want to do. Once they've established they have a following. That didn't matter in the 60s. Jack had very little power at Marvel to say, I don't want this book, I don't want to do this book, I don't want this inker, I don't want this to happen to the material, I don't want you to do this to the original art. And Jack was a product of that time, and the business was shaped by those guys, and I was part of the era that started to change. And then now you had another generation there where it's changed further, and it will continue to change. And Jack just wanted to live long enough to reap some of the benefits of the changes he knew were coming. He was very prescient. He knew the business was going to change. He just was afraid it wasn't going to change in time for him to get any rewards from it. So.
He
Anyway.
definitely, I mean, there's definitely a level on which Jack was just ahead of the game in ways that are actually astonishing. He did know what was going to happen. He called everything correctly. Hang on, small boy.
Just look down on the ground.
Oh, that's a copy of Pirate Stew on the ground, and here is your pink milk. You're welcome. I'm talking about Jack Kirby. That Jack, I think, alone had a vision of the current utter media domination of comics, of the way we've colonized other media. That the idea that was my son Mike, who off camera just then. Mike, that wasn't my son Mike. My son Mike is 38. That was my son Ash, who's 5. But Ash has Jack Kirby people on his underpants. And I just love the fact that you go out and you buy underpants and it's Jack Kirby Marvel characters.
I wear nothing.
For a 5-year-old.
I wear nothing else. That's it. I got them on right now.
We didn't see the evidence of that, Mark.
Sorry, what
We
about
didn't
that?
see the evidence.
Oh well, the nice part of doing these shows is you don't have to be nicely dressed from the waist down.
Right.
So, we got a few more minutes here before we hit our time limit on these things here. Is there anything else you guys want to say about Jack Kirby? Any thoughts you have that I haven't asked
wish
you?
I got to talk to him. I saw Jack the only time I've ever actually seen Jack. It was 1993. I was at a San Diego Comic Con. I was leaving the convention to catch a plane. I was running late. And Paul Levitz, I got out of an elevator, and Paul Levitz, who was publisher of DC, was in conversation with Jack. And I thought I should just go over and just say hello, just shake his hand. I thought, oh, I'm late for my plane. And I thought, and there'll be another time. There'll be another convention. I'll be here next year. And I went to San Diego Airport, which at that time was a tiny little airport, and waited for an hour or two for a plane that was, I think, about 2 hours late. While thinking, I should have just gone and I should have talked. I'm waiting at an airport. I could have been talking to Jack. And he passed away very shortly after that. And I never got to say my hello. And it wasn't the hello that I cared about. I never got to say thank you. And I wish I got to say thank you.
He had lots of people saying thank you to him. Not that this mitigates your regret here, but the last few years at the convention, it was fascinating. I'm going to put up a picture of Jack here for a second here. There's Jack, a nicer man you never met. He was nice to everybody. At the conventions, he would just stand there until he got old enough he had to sit down, and he would talk to anybody about anything. And you didn't, and if you came up to him and started saying, "Oh, Mr. Kirby, I love your work," it was like, "Okay, fine. Now let's talk about you." He liked knowing about the people he was with. He would ask you as many questions about you as you had about him. And I remember there were kids who'd come up and say, "Isn't it Dark Seed, not Dark Side?" And if they seemed to have emotion invested in the character being Dark Seed, he would tell them it was Dark Seed. He didn't want to disappoint anybody. And he was so good. I don't think some of the people who write about Jack these days understand that there is an affection for the man and an affection for the work that some of us cannot separate, because there was so much of him in the work. And I don't know anybody who has spent a lot of time with Jack who doesn't love the work because it was Jack. He was, and he's not the only person in the comic book business I would say that about, but there was a feeling of family around him all the time. He let everybody in, including some people I think he should have not let into his world because they were devious or exploited him in different ways. Just, you would have treasured that moment, Neil, for a long time and taken away with you, because he would have been so nice to you, even though, and it wouldn't matter that you were a writer or at that time maybe a beginning writer. He treated the spot welder well, I mean, he treated everybody well. Jonathan, you want anything you want to wrap up here before we end this?
I was on a flight once near a spot welder who I didn't get to say hello to, and now, previously that hadn't bothered me, but now that bothers me. No, I just kind of wish, and I hope, and I don't know if there's an answer. I hope he knew how much his work meant to all of us, and I hope he also, because I know he knew that his work would one day be appreciated and be hanging in museums. He knew that about Evercar in a way that many people were not prescient enough to know. But I hope he had, because it's a great shame that he died, because Dick, of course, lived long enough to see the Spider-Man movies, and even though he wanted no part of them, I think it must have been pleasant to see something that you had such a hand in, bringing so much joy to so many people, and still having the same kind of values that you put into it. And I wish Kirby had a chance to see just how dominant his ideas became in popular culture.
I think he knew. I asked him one time why he was putting in so much detail in the pencils when Vince Colletta might leave out some of those backgrounds. And he said, "I'm not drawing it for Vince, I'm drawing it for me." And then I said, it might survive. And he also said, and I swear to you, he said this, one of these days someone's going to reprint this stuff in bigger pages on better paper. There'll be deluxe editions in hardcover. And, I've got a whole shelf here of New Gods reprints. It makes me smile every time I look at it, remembering how the people at Licensing Corporation of America, which handled DC stuff, said, no one will ever merchandise these characters. There's never going to be a New Gods movie or a TV show. Hey, guess what? Jack saw all this coming. I told the story of how he predicted exactly what the San Diego convention would become, and how he was frustrated at Marvel when he was there the first time, because he told the executives there, these characters are going to be multi-million dollar properties and big movies, and they thought he was demented. They thought he was, a useful idiot. Just fill the damn pages, Jack. And no, we won't give you a raise. He saw all that coming. And and now people like look at his old stories and say, look, he predicted Donald Trump on this page. He predicted, this would happen. He predicted iPhones. Well, sometimes that's a stretch, but he knew that kind of thing was coming or that kind of thing was happening. And I do these panels in part because I just like spending time talking about Jack. He was such an amazing man, and I want people to know that. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time doing this. I know it was a hassle to coordinate our time zones to do this, and I thank you for carrying the torch of Kirby a lot. Neil, I got a text message. Jewel Shepard says hello in the middle of this. Yes, she is terrific. We will I hope to see you at an actual convention one of these days, both of you. I hope we have them.
I can't wait till we get to see each other again in real life.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's sit down.
All right.
In the flesh.
And thank you all for tuning in on this video. Please spread the word about it. It's not often you get to see two smart men like this talk about Jack Kirby for an hour. Thank you all.
Bye, Mark.
Okay.
Neil, great to see you.
So good seeing you, Jonathan. Bye-bye.
Love to all. Bye, guys.
Okay.